to harassment, aiming to silence them, and even their beloved ones face threats to stop certain information to be or from being published. Journalists and media workers further risk their lives to report from conflict zones. And this reminds me this year's award that was given to journalists from Palestine covering Gaza for their bravery, extreme bravery. And in line with the technological developments, there are also new threats emerging, and well, among others, artificial intelligence, but also very sophisticated spyware, as we know. However, we all know that only cooperation and united efforts can take us forward. And in this regard, the Media Freedom Coalition perfectly showcases a partnership between different stakeholders from all across the globe. In MFC, the MFC is a really unique initiative that brings together governments from all continents, civil society organizations, legal experts on media freedom, and UNESCO to collectively promote and enhance media freedom and protect journalists and media workers. The roles and tasks of each stakeholder are different, but we are all sharing the common purpose and working towards it. Shortly, you will hear more about it quite soon. I will personally only give few more examples, maybe also from my own country, Estonia. But number one, close cooperation with a consultative network comprising civil society organizations helps member states to create and maintain contacts with journalists, no matter where they are. And this is extremely important because this enables us to find out and to react to the specific needs of journalists in trouble much faster as we would otherwise do it. Number one, thanks to the high-level panel of legal experts of media freedom, Estonia established a safe refuge scheme to journalists from across the globe. And for this, Estonia issues 35 residence permits and a quite unlimited number of emergency visas to journalists and media workers who are threatened because of their profession. All these are only few small but positive outcomes that coalition's stakeholders' shared commitment has led us to. And I would also mention the Dutch initiative to work on an investigative task force to combat impunity of crimes against journalists. Dear colleagues, distinguished guests, we see today so many people from different countries who came to Chile to celebrate the World Press Freedom Day. This also shows that media freedom is a relevant topic and it impacts us all. And it also verifies the need for a multi-stakeholder cooperation with a global scope. And I would also use this opportunity to announce that in these days, Belgium has joined the coalition as 51st member state, and Ambassador of Belgium is among us. So I would end now my remarks with expressing gratitude to Chile and to UNESCO for their remarkable work in organizing this year's conference, but also many thanks to the Secretariat for putting all these side events together. And thank you. I'm looking forward, as you are, for further discussions.
Thank you very much, Katrin. Now, before we get into this very interesting discussion, I would like to give you a quick 5-minute roundup to provide some context to what we're going to talk about. We're going to try and talk about some actual examples of what the MFC has been doing with its various stakeholders. And we've got some quick roundup of how the progress has been in the last year or so. So hopefully this is the thing that works. The first thing I'd like to explain is some of the key initiatives that we have within the coalition and how these have developed over the past 12 months. Now, the first of these is through embassies. Now, one thing we've realized is because embassies are so close to where the threats are manifesting for journalists, they're in an excellent position to act on this through a range of things. And what we've seen in 2023, when we gathered together all the data we could find, was that in places where the MFC was bringing those embassies together, that was 18 countries, we saw 102 actions. And that compares very well, I think, with the previous year, where it was around 40 in 11 countries. And I know this is a little low down, our speakers might have to slightly duck here, but basically that included 35 events, speaking out on 20 different cases of journalists at risk, and 7 media outputs. One of those is one example that I'd like to highlight. This is from Bangladesh. This was a talk show on national television, which was initiated by 2 of the embassies in the country, which was all about gender equity in the media, and they invited on 3 women journalists, including Rosina Islam, who's extremely notable journalist there, an award-winning one. So great example of what embassies can help to bring about. The second area is one that we're going to talk about on this panel shortly, which is the advocacy that the MFC does on cases. And on this, of course, it's greatly informed and relies on the work of the consultative network of civil society organizations who bring those cases, for the most part, to the MFC. So again, if we compare 2022, there were 14 cases acted on by the MFC, 7 in public. In the last year, 2023, that was up to 20, and so that's a growing area, and of course we know the threats are certainly not receding, so there's growing demand for that kind of work as well. Some quick examples of some of what came out of that. Some of this work involved public joint statements of MFC nations, and of course that's an area that we're going to talk about later, but on occasions that generated some media coverage. We've got some from Bosnia-Herzegovina in the top left. Of course, you know the case of Evan Gershkovich, and down here we've got some coverage from the Hong Kong statement, which was right at the end of December. And then finally, there's the work on legal reforms, which is driven by the high-level panel of legal experts on media freedom. We're going to be hearing from Deputy Chair Zhan Yagintsu very shortly. But in 2023, the high-level panel was engaging with 19 of the 51 now MFC member states to provide bilateral support on and legal advice. And some notable examples of that, including Canada. We had an expanded refugee stream to provide safe refuge for human rights defenders, including journalists. They've expanded that scheme from 250 places a year up to 500. And in the Netherlands, we're very excited that they have been supporting a scoping study into an international investigative task force to look into crimes against journalists. That, of course, is another key recommendation of the high-level panel. So, again, we'll be coming on to some of this work in the discussion shortly. Finally, I would like to highlight the Global Media Defense Fund. That, of course, is the fund that a number of, around 17 member states of the MFC have been contributing money to. It's administered by UNESCO. Up to now, it has supported 120 projects, and those have supported 5,000 journalists, 1,500 lawyers, and 200 NGOs, and a lot of other good data that I couldn't quite fit in, but lots of strategic litigation coming out of that, well over 100 cases of that as well. So that moves us on, I think, if this thing will respond, to just a few examples that I recommend you go and look at. Google Global Media Defense Fund, and then scroll down to the news section. There's a lot of news stories there. One from Colombia on an excellent precedent that they set in the courts, one from the Philippines on training for journalists, and one from Bosnia-Herzegovina on a new media lawyers coalition. Just a small snapshot of what that fund has been doing. Please, if you want to read more about that, check out the latest annual report. We're now publishing reports every year around March to capture what's been happening. So just go to mediafreedomcoalition.org and go to the news section. And that leads us on to our panel. So I'd like to welcome our panelists. If our wonderful technicians over there could switch the screen back to Zhan and Ada, who are going to be joining us on the line, and then we can start the discussion. Hopefully, we can see Zhan Yagintsu shortly, because Zhan, I would like to start with you. Please, there we are. Tell me again, speak again, just to make sure we can hear you.
Greetings, Derek. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, hearing you very well. Excellent, we're hearing you very well. So, Zhan, you're the Deputy Chair of the High-Level Panel of Legal Experts on Media Freedom, and one of the things we want to focus on in this session is Safe Refuge for Journalists at Risk. And of course, you wrote the report on that for the high-level panel. Today, we're talking about case studies. So I wonder if you could just tell us, what's the state of play? How have MFC states responded to this challenge to date? And what are some of the cases that you would like to highlight of this work so far?
Thank you very much. Indeed, it's a pleasure to be joining you from New York on World Press Freedom weekend. So on Safe Refuge, Derek, I think it's worth taking a step back and acknowledging that the scale of the challenge is even greater today than it was in 2019, 2020, which is when the high-level panel decided that this was going to be an area of priority for it. And happily, the Media Freedom Coalition of States followed by designating Safe Refuge as a priority area of focus for the coalition. So I'm sure over the course of today, but also yesterday, the delegates in the room have heard the statistics, the record number of journalists that are under imminent risk, the number of journalists who are now in exile. But I'd just like to open by highlighting the fact, this will be clear to a great number of you in the room already, but it doesn't always come up in the statistics. Although we now talk about journalists in exile, of course, Marie Carr will be focusing on that in her next report, which is, I think, going to be published in June. For every exiled journalist, one needs to bear in mind that there are dozens of journalists who wish they could get to safety, but who are unable to get to safety. And that's why this emergency visa mechanism is so important. We still really live in a world in which the pathways to safety for human rights defenders as well as journalists are too few, they're too slow, and they're too burdensome. And in this respect, I think the work of the coalition has been extremely positive. We have the beginnings of momentum in this regard. And Derek, of course, you highlighted the Canadian scheme. We worked very, very hard with the Canadian government at the very, very start of this. And they, credit to them, established the first of its kind international protection scheme for journalists and human rights defenders. So Derek has gone up from 250 places to 500. Real pleasure also to hear from Ambassador Kiwi, because Estonia has also really stepped up in this regard. Not only on emergency visas, but also, of course, with the 35 residencies. So I think we have the beginnings of momentum. The Czech Republic, I could name a number of states in the Media Freedom Coalition here that are providing practical and effective remedies for journalists at imminent risk. But perhaps we can talk about what more can be done in due course as well. I know Tez is on the panel, so I'm going to hand it to him for Germany. I know Germany has got schemes in place as well. And we as the high-level panel are really looking forward to working with Germany. Now, they assumed co-chair States on the Media Freedom Coalition to see what more we can do on the issue of safe refuge. So I'll just leave it there for now. There's lots I can say on this. But I would just say that we have the beginnings of momentum. I wouldn't put it higher than that, but that in itself is obviously extremely encouraging.
Thank you very much, Jan, and we will be back with you shortly. And actually, you set up my next question well, because let's go to you, Matthias Kiesler, from the Federal Foreign Office of Germany, representing the other co-chair of the MFC. On this topic of safe refuge for journalists at risk, what are some of the examples you'd like to highlight, including, of course, what Germany itself is doing?
Yes, I would refer to the report by the high-level panel. We discussed it also last year at the World Press Freedom Day in New York. It's an excellent paper, and I think all member states of the MFC should have a look at it. There are so many good examples how we can maybe improve our visa system. As a matter of fact, Germany and Estonia and some others mentioned we are in a good position that we have opportunities and we have the legal means to bring people under stress to Germany. It is under Article 22 in our Residence Act. And until now, it's a couple of hundred alone journalists who came through the Hannah Arendt initiative to Germany, mainly Russians from Russia. And only recently we implemented a new module which opened it to journalists all over the world to come to Germany under this program. So we developed Hannah Arendt initiative, and now we have it more open for more journalists.
Great. Rosie, just turning to you. So you're coming from Internews, which is a member of the consultative network of the Media Freedom Coalition. And I know you've been looking at research into what the challenges are and, you know, to what extent the provision is matching that challenge that the journalists are facing. So what can you tell us about what those challenges are and the kind of responses you're hearing about here? You know, how do they match up?
Yeah, no, and I think sort of it's great to be having this discussion about sort of safe routes and safe refuge, and what we're seeing through the research. I'm sorry, this microphone is slightly odd. Is that safe refuge is very difficult to obtain, and even once you have safe refuge, there are a host of challenges that you're going to face as an individual, particularly if you want to continue working as a journalist, and particularly if you want to keep the outlet that you've been working with on air for the audiences back home that you are serving. So, you know, one of the respondents to some research that we published yesterday said, there is no safe, there is only safer. So recognizing that transnational repression is a really significant issue, and that authoritarian governments are wildly creative in terms of how they attempt to control people even from beyond their borders. But there are a host of other situations that journalists are dealing with. So once they are able to sort of work out their own legal position in a host country, if they wish to continue operating or continue their outlet operating, they have to try and navigate a really complex legal environment in order to understand how they might register their outlets in the new host country, and whether that should be as an NGO or whether that should be as a private company. Journalists that we spoke to for the research said they felt they often got that wrong because there simply wasn't the legal advice available to them. And of course, they're also concerned about the legal situation back home, which will be constantly evolving. They will have journalists and stringers operating back in the home country, and they need to desperately understand how the legal situation in that country is changing in order to keep people safe from a kind of editorial perspective. There are policies in place which may make it much more difficult to operate and to mention the country that they're coming from. So whether that be anti-terror legislation, whether that be international banking regulation, these are all things that make it difficult to operate because of the country that they're coming from. They're often working within an infrastructure where they're sort of obliged to use social media. Social media can provide extremely useful distribution channels for information back into the country from which they've come, but and a means of circumventing, sorry, what's the word I'm looking for? A means of governments will try and shut down websites if you're sending content through social media. Obviously, that's a means of reaching audiences. And that in itself produces problems because content moderation systems can often erroneously censor independent information coming from some of these countries, and it can also be weaponized by authoritarian regimes who want to suppress the impartial information coming into their country. Very, very briefly, other issues that they will deal with is revenue streams. The market back home may be closed off to them. They're not going to get advertisers from their home country wishing to advertise with them, which makes them very dependent on donor funding, which is extremely welcome, but also comes with challenges in terms of being short-term and perhaps more restrictive than would be helpful in order to deal with some of the challenges, unexpected challenges that they may be facing. Editorial, the journalistic work is made much more difficult because obviously they're operating remotely, they're trying to protect sources and journalists in country. It is much more difficult to verify information. And so journalists talk about doing reporting which is much slower and more expensive as a result. They've got to be thinking about security, safety, their digital protection in a much more robust way than might be the norm. And finally, they're thinking deeply about how to protect audiences who are themselves taking great risks to access the information that they're providing. So there are a whole host of challenges, complex challenges, which are beyond the issue of safe refuge that we're also thinking about.
Thank you for that comprehensive answer. One of the things I'm lucky about is that everyone on this panel is eminently qualified to talk about both of the issues we're covering today. Jose, in a short while, will talk to you about your father and, of course, how the MFC has been involved there. But on this issue of safe refuge, I think specifically we're seeing journalists from Guatemala who have left the country. So what's your understanding of the kind of challenges they're facing and how governments might be able to help with that?
Thank you. Thank you for everything. I have to start by thanking the Media Freedom Coalition and its 51 member states, the Secretariat and the consultative bodies. You are doing an exceptional job. It's more valuable than you can imagine, and it is having an impact. There is definitely more that needs to be done, and things can also be faster. But in general, it's invaluable, and there are no words to express gratitude. I think, and this is happening all over the world, we're seeing this authoritarian regression all over, and these repressive regimes copy from each other. So you're seeing this criminalization of journalists and activists and anybody who is opposition. In the case of Guatemala, there's at least 30 journalists in exile. And I think one of the major challenges is really not only that they have to leave their country, their lives, their work, but it's very hard to move to another country and not to be able to work. So I think that's one key issue where there's a lot of work that can be done and that would be really helpful. Just being not able to, the first step is just being able to leave the country in time. But then once you're safer, you need to be able to work and to contribute to the community where you're living now, but also to find ways in which you can contribute from there to your country. And now we're all seeing this trend of journalism from exile, right? Which is, it's growing.
Yeah. Thank you. Jean, I'd like to return to you because it would be great to hear a bit more about how you and the panel members have worked with governments to make this happen, because in a way, this is the dream for us, is to try and get those policies changed, to get those reforms through, but it can be a difficult, sensitive, painstaking process. What can you tell us about how you've managed to do that and how we should then take those lessons forward?
Thank you, Derek. I think the key point on any initiative, and we've seen this across the various initiatives that the panel have been trying to lead on, is you need the first state to step up, and in this area it was Canada, and then you need others obviously to follow, and ultimately the way we've worked is to provide a report that deals with the issue generally, that provides specific recommendations which are applicable, hopefully, to all Media Freedom Coalition states. But then we've entered into a number of bilateral meetings, workflows, whatever you want to call them, with individual states on a confidential basis, and looked at the legislative background, looked at what is possible politically, and that has led to, happily, some movement and some momentum. We've also been hugely assisted by our friends in the consultative network. I should make that sort of very, very clear. Even when we were preparing the report, and I can speak to this personally as the report author on Safe Refuge, we worked very, very closely with members of the consultative network to make sure that our recommendations dealt not only with the Safe Refuge part, as Rosie highlighted, but also what happens hopefully, once the journalist and his or her family, hopefully, have been moved to safety. So I think it does require, trust and confidence on both sides. It needs to be, one needs to be willing to roll up one's sleeves and get into the detail and see what is possible in an individual state's framework. And some states are easier than others. That's just the reality. And I think where we are here, Derek, on Safe Refuge is we're in a position where we definitely need more states to step up. We need regional champions. At the moment, in terms of the states that moved this area, they have been North America and Europe focused. We need regional champions all over the 6 continents of the Media Freedom Coalition. We also need to strengthen the existing schemes that have been established since 2019, 2020. And I think we really need to, when we look to the additional support that journalists, once they're safe, need to receive, we need to acknowledge that it's more than just the states. I mean, the states can do so much, but there needs to be private actors, NGOs, who also step up. But when we're focusing on journalists in exile, we need to not take our eye off the ball on the Safe Refuge paths themselves. So as I said, we have some states doing good work in this area, but we can't take that for granted. So as the high-level panel, just to close off, my answer to you, as a high-level panel, we're not only looking to new states and new bilateral engagements, but we're also looking to maintain our bilateral engagements with states such as the Czech Republic, Canada, Estonia, Germany, Latvia, Lithuania, etc., that have moved in this area.
So I've been working on, thanks, Derek. I've been working on some research on behalf of SEMA, which looks at media in exile, and specifically looks at the kind of ecosystem, the development ecosystem, and different stakeholders involved in supporting exiled media and media in exile. And I should say that the paper starts from this very premise that exile media is the new norm, that the category has grown, the category is changing, that more and more media are operating these sort of hybrid operation models across different states and different countries. And that's something that the development sector and donors and supporters of exiled media need to reflect. I interviewed, obviously, exiled media organizations who are receiving support from donors, and as I think was mentioned earlier, most of these organizations and the context within which they've come from are donor dependent and remain donor dependent, and exile has made that even more entrenched, that dependency on donors, and that is an issue. But I also interviewed some of the institutional donors and philanthropic donors who are supporting Exile Media to get a sense of the challenges that they're facing. Advocating internally for many of the many institutional donors, advocating internally for media freedoms and then Exile Media sometimes becomes challenging, is challenging. And that's where they need more support. And that's where there needs to be better coordination amongst donors and the community that's supporting Exile Media. There needs to be more dialogue so that support can be more sustained, can have more impact, can address issues like sustainability, financial sustainability, viability, but also some of the issues that Rosie touched on, like sourcing practices, where you no longer have reporters on the ground, for example, in some cases in Sudan, where you're relying on citizens as your sources, where accuracy, fact-checking, all of these things, professional norms that we perhaps might have taken for granted and associate with independent media become a bit more challenged. One of the other things that also came up on that front was this push towards Exile Media becoming advocates for their countries, or for human rights violations in their countries, and how that also can sometimes be at odds with professional journalism norms, and how that also suggests we need to rethink the category.
Thank you, Ada. So Matthias, just quickly with you as we sort of, before we move on to the other part of the discussion, as co-chair of the MFC, you're clearly looking, as Jeanne says, that this is one of the issues that the MFC can build momentum on. How does this fit into sort of Germany's priorities as you're near the start of your term of being co-chair?
Actually, I want to take up what you said, Jose. The challenge that journalists should have the opportunity to work in the country they're living. This is the big challenge. It's not enough to give refuge to the journalists more. This was from the very beginning in our concept of the Hannah Arendt initiative, at least in Germany, to provide the means that they can work to establish a working space for them. But even more, especially for those coming from Russia and from Belarus, we thought it is good not support them individually, but to support whole media outlets. So you have networking and they can work from the very beginning as editorial staff. So this is the whole concept. It's a challenge still. But what is good with our law is that they can stay when they are under this paragraph 22, they can stay in Germany unlimited, and then from the very beginning they have a working permit. This is very good, and we, as I said, we try to expand this scheme.
Great. So, Jeanne, just quickly, I guess a closing message on this issue from you would be perhaps the high-level panel's doors are open for states to seek advice on this so that we can keep building that momentum.
Derek, absolutely. And I think it's sort of twofold would be the call. The first would be to encourage members of the Media Freedom Coalition who've not taken steps in this area to approach us to see if we can explore what can be done. And it's not an all-size-fits-all model. It's not every... You know, with Canada, we decided to go down the international protection route. It was actually even more ambitious than an emergency visa because there was the will to do it. So we will look at safe refuge in the round. Emergency visas are obviously a key practical part of that conversation. But the second thing I would say on behalf of the panel is to the states who have moved in this area and who are now looking to either improve the offering or to see how they can bring other stakeholders to assist them, because this is not something, as I said a moment ago, that is really in the gift only of the state. I mean, the state is an absolutely critical actor here. Civil society, absolutely critical actors here. But also I think, and we think as the panel, that there may be a role for other private actors to assist here so that we can really work up these programs so that each country can be proud of its own individual program for journalists at risk. And also, human rights defenders. I think it's really very positive that the Media Freedom Coalition states have not confined this to journalists, but recognized that the sorts of risks faced by journalists are also being faced by human rights defenders all over the world.
Thank you, Jan, and please stay there. I'm sure there will be more questions on this coming up. So we're going to sort of transition now to the other issue that we're covering in this discussion, which is what we call coordinated advocacy. This is all about actually what we call cases of concern. So these are these cases of journalists at risk, or sometimes entire countries that are deteriorating in terms of media freedom. These are raised or submitted to the embassy with requests for action. And then what we do at the Secretariat is we work with the states to try and make that action happen. Jose, of course, I'd like to start with you. Now, your father in prison in Guatemala that's one of the cases that the MFC has acted on. Could you just kick off by telling us why it's important for governments to be getting involved in these cases, speaking out, or doing that private, quiet diplomacy? What does that add to, the advocacy that already exists?
Well, I think the key issue is that these repressive regimes and corrupt administrations like to operate in darkness. The less information there is about issues and persecution, the better they feel and the more freedom they feel to continue those practices. So I think everything that the members do to denounce these issues, to come out publicly and do statements saying the world is watching, it has an impact that it's hard to understand, but it's very important because they realize that the world is watching, and that makes them think twice about doing worse things. In general, the persecution of journalists has evolved over the years. Before, governments used to do two things. One was defamation campaigns, because they know the only asset a journalist has is its credibility. And from the other side, it was physical threats and assassination attempts. But they realized that assassination attempts come at a very high cost. So they evolved and they started using the law to persecute journalists. First, civil law, and then most recently, criminal law, which is, it has been a terrible but very effective tool because it allows them to either make sure that journalists flee the country and go into exile, or to imprison them indefinitely. So I think anything you can do to talk about these cases publicly, to denounce what's happening, and to make sure that you let these repressive regimes know that the world is watching, makes a world of difference.
Thank you, and we will definitely come back to you to talk more about your father. But Matthias, I wanted to come to you just to cover for us a little bit about what the states are actually doing to respond to these cases, because each case is very different. Some of them are very sensitive, some of them, the states can speak more publicly. What are the kind of range of actions that they can do?
No, that's true. They're so different. Each case is different. But I would like to stress that I see, especially in the Media Freedom Coalition, added value when we deal with cases. And there are different means how we can do it. We can do it through public statements. It can work, and very often also we have other means to do it, through silent democracy, for example. I mean, we had some cases, one case recently when our embassies in the Democratic Republic of Congo came together, and they had the idea to issue a statement. It was coordinated with us, with the co-chairs, and the result, it was a positive result. The journalist was sentenced. Yes, this is negative, but the positive part is maybe through our intervention that the fine was relatively minimum. So the result was quite good. There's another case in an Asian country where we deliberately uses still diplomacy, silent diplomacy behind doors. And also in this case, we were able, through our embassies in this country that this person was released very quickly. So sometimes it works with public statements, sometimes it does not work. Sometimes we have public statements that has not the result that a person will be released. With Jevan Gershkovich. But on the other hand, what was positive, that the Minister of Russia mentioned MFC at a UN body, and it means, somehow we are recognized as a player that at least some countries see that we are doing. So it depends on case by case the result, but I repeat again, I think this is one of the big advantages of a Media Freedom Coalition. Instead of doing state by state, together we are much stronger.
Yes, and important to clarify, thinking about that example in DR Congo, there was a lot of other advocacy taking place, and a lot of legal work as well, done by civil society, trial monitoring done by the embassies of the MFC. So it all kind of fitted together to, I think, make quite an effective response to what we were seeing there. Rosie, so from the consultative network point of view, this is, of course, one of the critical roles that the consultative network plays within the MFC, is raising these cases, advising on what needs to be done, and increasingly, I think, recently collaborating with the states to make sure they're actually very coordinated on what happens. So what's the perspective from the CN, as we say, the consultative network, on how this is going and what's been learned and what more needs to be done?
But maybe I would like to step in with the case of Congo. I mean, it came from civil society, in this case from Reporter Without Borders. So we work together already. This is indeed very important that we have you.
Yes. Absolutely, and I think that just if people aren't aware that the consultative network is a network of 22 press freedom media support organizations who exist. Well, the official mandate is to monitor the activities of the Media Freedom Coalition and also to propose cases which the Media Freedom Coalition might look at. And actually, we've had some really excellent discussions in recent days about how that relationship can evolve beyond what we describe as monitoring, which we might question, is that the appropriate way to describe a more collaborative partnership, as you've just alluded to, Matthias. So we've thought about positive things that we can do to move the relationship forward and to ensure that this sort of civil society part of the partnership can be really effective and useful. And we've talked about, firstly, the possibility and the desirability of evaluating some of the cases which have worked particularly well and trying to understand what was it about those cases, some of which we've talked about today, that meant that they were successful. We've also talked a bit about the possibility of setting up working groups around cases which would bring a range of expertise to bear on discussions about how to strategize about dealing with that case. As you rightly say, there are going to be different approaches which are going to be effective in different cases. So bringing together sort of country level expertise with thematic expertise, around things like sanctions, so that collectively civil society and MFC states can think about what's going to be the most effective approach. I think there's a real desire for kind of improved information flow around cases. So obviously the consultative network at this stage will propose cases, and then often because they are involved, for example, with the families of affected journalists, it becomes particularly important to be able to sort of report back or give updates on the progress of those cases. And sometimes, of course, progress is slow, but it's still really useful to be able to say that. And cases are sometimes dealt with, it's sometimes most effective to deal with them through private diplomacy. But where that is the case, I think there's also a desire for that to be communicated so that everybody is on the same page about what the strategy is going to be. And also kind of taking this case-by-case working group approach, it's also going to be possible to surface where individual states are taking action in a way independently of the MFC, and that action is still really, really valued, but it's very useful for that to be known about. And so in general, I think there's a sort of sense that this is already a powerful collaboration, but so much more of the respective strengths of MFC states and civil society organisations involved could be leveraged. I think maybe a final point about, you know, I think which Jan was making to some degree, is that at the moment cases are handled by a small number of member states, and that it would be fantastic, not just from a capacity point of view, but also an expertise point of view, to ensure a sort of greater geographical spread of the member states who are handling cases. I think that's something else that we would also really like to see for the future.
Thank you, Rosie. Now, one of the things we've talked about here is public statements. So the MFC, for example, in 2023 published 6 statements that were on cases, where, you know, a number of the governments will sign on to this statement as an advocacy effort. Ada, you have been researching this for us in a sort of joint research project with the Freedom Online Coalition to try to understand how do we maximize the impact of these statements, because I can tell you, as the Secretariat, it does take a lot of time and capacity to make these things happen. So Ada, although this is not published yet, this is a forthcoming paper, I wonder if you could just give us some sort of headline select findings that you'd like to contribute to this discussion.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Derek. So just to frame the discussion, the learning paper is based on interviews with member states in both the MFC and the Freedom Online Coalition, as well as members of the consultative and advisory networks, and interviews with journalists and local civil society organizations who might have seemed to have benefited from statements that might have been issued by either of the organizations. And what particularly stood out, I'll just highlight a kind of a few findings which have been touched on by this panel already. And speaking to what Jose said earlier on, it particularly stood out that statements are seen as an effective way to raise awareness of violations by states, to provide solidarity to those affected by those violations, and to clearly demonstrate that the international community is monitoring those violations. In this regard, what was very interesting was that local civil society organizations were more likely to view statements as effective than international NGOs or organizations were. And for them, the effectiveness of statements becomes even more acute in the case where member states have a diplomatic presence in the country, for example, where the statement is being issued. So there we see sort of public and private coming together. The local journalists interviewed also felt that statements could at times prevent an escalation in what's already a challenging situation. So there's clearly, from that perspective, statements do have a place in public diplomacy efforts. A couple of other interesting findings that emerged was that member states found statements useful for internal advocacy within their own departments and ministries when advocating on issues related to media freedoms and human rights violations. So the process of circulating statements for sign-off and approval, for language and wording, regardless of whether or not a statement was published or signed, still supported them in their advocacy efforts around some key issues. And that was quite an interesting finding around statements. We talked about case-specific statements. One thing that did come up in the learning paper was around the usefulness of thematic statements. So those are statements that focus on particular issues or principles or areas of concern in relation to media freedoms or digital rights. And those statements were seen as particularly effective tools for accountability and advocacy and norm setting and defining terminologies, context situations. So, for example, there was a statement that was issued on transnational repression, and that particular statement was seen to be used effectively as a definition of transnational repression. So governments were referencing that statement in multilateral forums. CSOs were referencing that statement and the phraseology in their research or their advocacy, and that's again where statements live beyond the life cycle of their publishing, so to speak. There were obviously some issues around, or some areas where statements could be improved. There was a lot of feedback on the sort of disconnect between the objectives or goals of statements amongst different stakeholders within both the MFC and the FOC, and that perhaps sometimes because those goals hadn't been agreed in advance, there was less alignment on whether a statement was or not effective or not effective. So again, for example, one of the interviewees talked about a statement that was issued on internet shutdowns in Iran. And apparently there was a lot of conversations about the fact that the statement did not stop or end internet shutdowns in Iran. And again, it was the conversation around sort of providing clarity around what the objective of that statement was, which was to talk about the importance of having an open and stable internet as a basic right. So there were those types of areas for improvement also came up. There was some clear, in the learning paper, there were some clear elements to a statement that stakeholders did agree made a difference in terms of effectiveness. One was timing, issuing statements. It takes time to agree on an issue statement. So ensuring that statements are issued in a timely and relevant manner was something that was talked about. And again, the Ivan Gershkovich case was mentioned. Why that statement was effective was because of the timing of the statement, or one of the elements was the timing of the statement being released, whereas other statements that might have taken much longer to be issued and were issued a long time after the event might have happened have had less impact. A lot of people talked about the importance of rooting statements in action and having clear next steps or actions or call to actions within statements. This was something that many stakeholders felt made statements more effective or might lead to some kind of sustainable impact. And then finally also there was talk of statements being rooted in human rights principles and standards, referencing international frameworks and regulatory mechanisms. All of these were seen to be key elements as part of effective statements. I'll end there.
So we very much look forward to seeing the paper. We're working on it. Jose, let me come back to you, because I think what Ada said there spoke to some of what you said. That point about preventing an escalation, in a way that's an achievement, even though it might be hard to see, So can you just tell us about your father's situation? There's been a political change in Guatemala. How has this sort of advocacy helped, if it has, and what would you like to see now?
Well, I think, and I also wanted to add something to what Ada said, in which she made great points, and I'm also looking forward to reading the report. I think the statements and the sanctions and all of these different steps and efforts are very helpful. From one side, they do help the journalist who is being persecuted, who is imprisoned, but also they stop the persecution from other journalists. So it is helpful because not only is the help for a specific case in the country, but it's helping the entire field of journalism, right? And of journalists. In the case of my father, well, I have to start by saying he's innocent, and his only crime was doing journalism and denouncing corruption at the highest level of government in the administration of Alejandro Yamatei, which is the previous administration. In persecuting him, the government had three objectives. One was really to punish him directly, right? Like he was a problem for them, and his team were publishing all these stories. Like in the first 145 weeks of his administration, the newspaper El Periódico published 145 investigations about corruption in his government. The second objective was shutting down the newspaper El Periódico, which was the main investigative newspaper in the country. And the third objective, which I think it's the third objective, but it's probably the most important one, is they wanted to send a message to all journalists in the country that they can really go after all of them. and that they just should be very careful about what they publish. So I think that's where this link is with the Media Freedom Coalition and the member states and everybody involved, because it's not only about the specific cases, but it's about really supporting the journalists who are still there, who are still doing the job, and who are ensuring that citizens know what's happening, that citizens have the information they need to demand, I don't know if it's an end, but to a curb to corruption, right? My father, he has been in pre-trial detention for 645 days today. That exceeds by far the legal limit for pre-trial detention. He has been held in terrible conditions, in isolation, in a terrible cell. By law, nobody can be in the type of cell he is for over 30 days. He has been in one of those cells for 645 days. So it's ridiculous and it's unacceptable. And it's really, by international standards, it's torture. And what's interesting and terrible is that we had a change of power. The new administration is, I believe, is genuinely decent and wants to do what's right. They recognize that this is political persecution, and this was started by the previous administration. But even though there's a new executive, the judiciary and the General Attorney's Office is still run by the corrupt, and they are the ones that have the judiciary in their hands. So they continue to harass and persecute journalists. They are persecuting the new president. They are trying to give something like a judicial coup, right? Like it's they're very innovative. And so I think that's another type of work that needs to be done. It's like to push for these judicial reforms, right? We need new courts, we need new judges, and that's where we also think that the case of my father will be solved. Like, he's innocent. He had to face a case on that's a fabrication. They violated due process. They've been pretty much holding him hostage for all this time. But we do believe that once his case falls into the hands of impartial judges who are really focused on justice, he will be absolved and freed. But that's the issue, right? Like, it's the system isn't justice, right? The system is co-opted and being run by the corrupt.
Thank you, Jose. Matthias, any quick reactions from you on those findings? Because this is something we think about, we talk about within the MFC machine, isn't it? It's sort of whether to do a statement and how long it will take.
First of all, I would like to refer what Aida said. I look forward to receiving this report. I think we need feedback. We are not perfect. We are working on a daily basis how to improve it. One point I think it's important to understand that it takes time. It is when one state issues a statement, it can be done much more quickly, and we have to see about the procedures, how we can make it better. And the question now is...
Well, yeah, just reflecting on the findings that you heard from Ada, is there anything that sort of aligns with your thinking?
I scribbled down some of them. One, as I already said, it's timing. What I also want to underline is I was not really aware of it. Yes, it's an internal advocacy. When I think about it, how we deal it within our foreign office, yes, it's important that our political department, they're dealing with the countries, they know that there are these cases, and then they understand that there are also cases when journalists are under stress. Sometimes they are not aware of it, and it's really a good tool that we have these statements.
Yep. We're coming towards the end, but I'd just like to see if there are any questions, because we do have a remote mic that we can hand around if so. If not, I certainly do have more questions. Can't see any hands at the moment. Okay. If we can pass it along. Please introduce yourself when you speak.
Hi, I'm Davy from Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Estonia, covering media freedom related questions too. And I have a question. I believe it will be mostly for you, Jose, but maybe Rosie will have a thought in it as well. It's related to the no harm policy that obviously as governments we follow, that we don't need to, or we don't want to have further negative impact on family members as well. And in several occasions, I have heard some journalists or representatives of civil society organizations say that with this no harm policy, you actually take away any connection with us, and you end up creating more cause or more negative impact to us, that they're actually against our do no harm policy. So I would be very curious to hear about that. And if I can have a second question that I believe would be a little bit rather to Ada, or maybe also a bit to Rosie, and of course, if anyone has some thoughts on that. So mostly the MFC issues one statement on a specific issue, and we do not normally issue like a second statement on that, and that might leave some sort of an impression that this case is off the table, and we know more follow this, or the MFC did this one statement and now they finished working on that. But then of course there is also the matter of capacity. So my question is, like, with the limited capacity, what would be wiser? Should we focus on one case and issue more statements on this topic, or we should rather think that, okay, well, there is so much going on that we don't manage to cover all of the cases of concern that we would want to. So should we take another case and try to shed more light on other things happening in other parts of the world? Thank you.
Thank you, Devi. Jose, so Devi, as I understood quickly, your first question is on the do no harm policy is, does it almost make governments overcautious or sort of prevent action from taking place that actually would help? But of course, governments might not want to take the risk. So, Jose, is that something you've encountered, that you would actually like to see more action, but that you can see that there's a concern that could it result in worse repercussions for your father?
Yes, absolutely, and that's both are great questions, and I do think that it's a legitimate concern, but I think it's definitely, and I'm also speaking personally in the case of my father, like having gone through this and this experience, I feel like, and he has also had like this 30-year career when he was even like, there's been assassination attempts, but the situation he's in right now, there cannot be harm, right? Like, he's in the worst possible situation. The entire family had to leave the country because they were also being persecuted. So anything and everything that MFC can do or states can do is welcome and it's important. I do understand that there's also, like, and we've been talking about this, each case is different, and each country is different, and in some cases, like back channels and diplomacy is probably better than a public statement. But I think it's very important to work with the organizations that are working with the families, and there's so many great organizations, right? Like there's Reporters Without Borders, there's the Committee to Protect Journalists. I have like a never-ending list of angels, really, like who are always there doing incredible work. I would say the answer is like you need to have an open line of communication with the families. In my father's case, I would say there's no harm you can do. The harm is being done locally, and you can only help. Anything you do will help improve things. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. On the second question, Rosie or Ada, although anyone is welcome to comment. Ada, do you, or
Jean,
oh, Jean, sorry, Jean, you're yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
To take my high-level panel hat off just for a moment and put on my counsel hat, because obviously I'm counsel on some of these cases. I just wanted to say, in relation to the statements, I mean, I remember as counsel for Maria Ressa how long it took to get a statement out from the Media Freedom Coalition in relation to the situation in the Philippines then, and how much quicker the statement on Evan Gershkovich is now with the new mechanism. So I remember the position 2019. The position today is undoubtedly much improved. Of course, there is more that can be done. In terms of the two excellent questions that have been posed, in relation to one, I would just like to echo, say, of course, every case of every journalist is going to turn in on its own circumstances. But the way the structure works is that you would hope that the consultative network that has the experts really on the ground, the NGOs, civil society, who are in touch with family members, etc., will be able to provide states confidentially with at least guidance on what they perceive to be some of the sensitivities or what might be effective. And then, of course, you have the missions in the country, the states, they will have their own internal expertise. So there are checks and balances, I think, within the system to help ensure or at least mitigate the risk of states coming together to do something that might harm a journalist or a journalist's family. In relation to the second question, it's a very good one. I think, again, that's going to depend on the journalist, on the state, but of course there are milestones in any case. You know, a journalist being investigated, a journalist being indicted, unfortunately, and a journalist's conviction coming up for appeal. So it would be very, very strange, I think, with my counsel hat on, to conceive of a system where you issue a statement very early on and then you do nothing else if the situation does not improve. And of course, as I said, you know, there's limited resources, and also every case will turn on its facts. In many cases, we've seen sometimes what starts as public diplomacy may then shift with to private diplomacy, where the state actually seems to be taking heed that public diplomacy. So I think it's very, very hard to generalize. I just want to make one additional point for completeness for members of the audience, just in relation to how the Media Freedom Coalition operates. Of course, there will sometimes be cases at the international level where courts come to a body like the high-level panel to intervene in a case that is before an international court. And the Inter-American Court did come to us to formally intervene in a case against Ecuador and a criminal defamation. So there are also those formal mechanisms, not cases of concern, but cases where international tribunals and courts come to the high-level panel as the legal experts in the Media Freedom Coalition and ask for their expertise in the context of a case of wider public importance in media freedom.
Thank you, Jan. We're very near the end, so in a way I think I'll just sort of open the floor quickly to see if anyone would like to make any final points on the panel about what they've heard, any quick reflections. But if not, that is also fine, because it's already 7 o'clock in the evening. So I'd like to thank our panel, but before we finish, I'd also like to invite Laxman Pant from Media Action Nepal, who's also a co-chair of the consultative network, just to provide us with some closing remarks, after which I'll properly thank everyone. But please, Laxman, go ahead, because we thought it would be great to hear your perspectives on all of these issues.
Thank you very much, Derek. Thanks, everyone. And I'm so happy that the co-chair from Estonia and high-level legal panel, also Rosie, highlighted some of the points to best utilize CN presence globally. That CN today makes of 22 organizations, but also there is a broader CSO list that we have now expanded up to 112 organizations. So we're looking very much forward to engaging with the MFC in relations to our strength at the global level, but also the regional and local perspectives. With this reality, we look forward to the closer engagement. The best case that high-level panel came from is not to harm anyone, but also look into how best the CN expertise is utilized in this context. As many of you are aware about, this year is an election year, and it is very important for the health of democracy. So also we'd like to see harnessing our expertise, the CN expertise of different organizations from diverse media freedom CSOs, presenting at the global, regional, and national level again. We'll continue to prioritize key issues such as ensuring the safety of journalists, as highlighted in this panel as well, including those seeking safe haven, and also the safety of journalists in relation to escalating legal and digital threats that journalists at the global level face today. Also, the role of CN, as Roji also highlighted, is not just to present the cases of concern to MFC, but also to look into and to monitor the pledges and the missions, especially the MFC member states made the pledges at the beginning and their missions as well. Also, looking forward, my final thoughts on behalf of the consultative network is the role of MFC in defending press freedom is an important, as ever, in this critical year for democracy, as I mentioned. And the attacks against journalists, including transnational repression of journalists, are on the rise. So we would love to see Media Freedom Coalition engaging with the consultative network, utilizing CN's global strength. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Laxman, for your thoughtful words. And that brings to a close our session. I would like to thank our amazing panel. I've had such fun just asking all of these interesting questions and getting even more interesting answers. So, Jeanne and Ada, thank you so much to you for making the time, especially you, Ada, there in the UK, where it's gone midnight. Very, very grateful to you for sticking around. Jose, Matthias, Rosie as well. Please give a big round of applause and good night.